Hello and welcome to the second video in the Genealogy Basics photograph series. In part 1 we looked at the type of photographs available. In this video we'll examine the details of the photograph and see what we can use to date and identify the photograph and the people in it. The first step in dating any photograph is to examine it in detail. Not only will we look at the subjects, but we'll also examine the background, the foreground, the frame if it has one, the reverse, and anything else that may be pertinent to try to date the photograph. For this, you'll almost certainly need a good magnifying glass to examine the original, as well as a high-definition copy that we can zoom into on the computer. As we go through, we can note down each dating aspect as we find them, and then once we've finished with finding all the different parts of the photograph, we can use them together to complete an assessment of the date and perhaps even the subjects of the photo. Many old photographs are remarkable in the features that can be seen once you use a magnifying glass or zoom into the detail. For instance, looking at these examples, on the photograph on the left we have zoomed into a badge on the right lapel. This is clearly a British Silver War badge given to wounded veterans in World War I, and on his right lapel is a small boutonniere, indicating a special occasion, perhaps even a wedding. These two items alone will give us good information to date with. Looking at the photograph on the right hand side, if we zoom into the couple and we look at the lady's hand, we can see a wedding ring and probably an engagement ring, as well as a bracelet. This obviously is a good indication that she is married. And the pose may lead us to believe there's some affectionate relationship between the couple, as the man has got his hand on the back of the lady's chair. So perhaps it's a wife and husband, or father and daughter, or brother and sister. The ages look comparatively close, so it's possible that it's a brother or sister, or a husband and wife. Again, some small details that give us clues about the photograph. Here we're not just looking at the subjects of the photograph, but also looking around the photograph and on the reverse side to see what other information we can find out. In the example on the left, this photograph has been written extensively on the reverse. It is dated and it says "Love from Mother." It has the subject's names and actually it's got another annotation at the bottom. It looks like 3 different people have written on this photograph, and it would be actually good to know who the people were who wrote on the photograph. But we cannot assume that the writing is always correct. But it would be a very good place to start to know that this was taken in August 1945. On the right, the cabinet card has got good information about the photographer and studio embossed on both the bottom and reverse of the photograph. And with a little bit of work on the internet, the dates of when the photographer and the studio were active are available. In this case, simply knowing the photographer and studio dates the photograph between 1890 and 1901. When we first look at a picture, the first thing we notice, or the first thing our eyes are drawn to, is often what the people are wearing. And leaving uniforms aside, as we'll discuss them later, clothing and fashion are often excellent ways of estimating the period in which the picture may have been taken. Now, if there's a group of people, note if there's a fashion difference between the older ones and the younger ones. And good clothing was expensive, and unless the subjects were wealthy, it was only worn on special occasions. So note if the photograph is celebrating a special occasion of any kind. The photograph on the left, taken at a gallery in 1909, shows a broad similarity in the clothing, but with obvious distinct differences with each of the women. Each of these fashions will need investigating when dating the photograph, but the overall fashion style confirms the date to around 1910. However, when we're dating a photograph based on clothing, we also need to look beyond the fashion of the time and think about context and class and location and occasion. On the left hand side we have 2 photographs taken around the same date. The first photograph is from the last slide, a pair of apparently fashionable women, and the photograph next to it is a picture of a prisoner in northeast England. There are some fundamental differences in the clothing, obviously, as one would expect poor people to be wearing old, used or cast off clothes. This is something we need to account for. On the right side we have a group of men from Australia pictured in 1860. The men are dressed in a variety of ways. It's possible that men in Australia were less inclined to follow the fashion in America and Europe, unless perhaps they were also European or American. So in addition to the fashion, the location and occasion will also influence our dating estimates. In addition to clothes, for many years hats for both men and women followed their own flamboyant or reserved fashion styles. So when looking at hats, we also need to consider whether the subject is upper, middle or working class based on the context of the time, as this would often influence their choice of hats. In these two photographs, both taken around the beginning of the 20th century, we can see instinctively the different classes of people involved and the different types of hats. So in the top picture, it looks like there's more upper or middle class people out for a stroll in the park, whereas in the bottom picture, it's probably more of a working class, middle class environment in a town centre. So taking account of the class and the location, the hats put the people in context for the time. Moving on from clothes and hats, we can next look at people's hairstyles, especially women's hairstyles. Hair fashion is a constantly evolving field, with new styles emerging and old ones making comebacks with some regularity. And in some circumstances, it can be relatively easy to date a hairstyle. Also look out for hair accessories such as headbands, scrunchies, hair clips, as they also play a role in fashion. We talked about context and class earlier on, and the length of the hair may indicate a woman's role that they play in society. Working women may not have wanted to have their hair long. Although a personal choice, we also need to take into account the age of women, as younger women tend to adopt more fashionable styles. On the other hand, men's hair fashion, if there was one at all, is much more difficult to date. If we cannot date men by their hairstyle, one thing we can look at are their beards and moustaches. They tend to go through fashionable periods in a very similar way to hairstyles in women. If we look at a picture on the left, taken in 1918, we can see most of the men have adopted a very similar style of dress and a very similar moustache. But what jumps out in the photograph is the man on the second row, who has a different style of dress and is wearing a beard. Now this may indicate the different relationship between that one man in the middle and the rest of the men in the photograph. That would be interesting to find out. As with clothing, younger men are much more likely to follow fashion regarding beards and moustaches. Here are some examples of beards and moustaches and even sideburns that may help you date your photograph. On the left, we've got some fairly extravagant sideburns, often called mutton chops. Those were around not for a great long period, but we don't tend to see them today. Abraham Lincoln is sporting what we'd call a helmet strap beard without a moustache. We can still see that style around today in the Amish communities of New York and Pennsylvania. The third person along, who's actually one of my relatives, sporting a full beard, full set as it's called. We still see that style around today. And the final photograph is of Howard Taft, US President, with what we'd call a handlebar moustache. Perhaps see it today, but it was fairly indicative of a period. And in fact, it would appear that Howard Taft was the last US President to actually have facial hair, so that was well over 100 years ago. Uniforms too are an excellent way of dating photographs. Not only do we see military uniforms, but many other organizations have uniforms too. The type and cut of the uniform itself, together with badges, insignia and buttons, all insist in narrowing down the date range. If it is a formal studio photograph, it may coincide with a promotion or significant event. And this is where colorization often helps with the detail. If you know the regiment or branch, there will normally be a specialist website that you can go to for specifics on the uniform and badges. The example on this page is a group of volunteer factory firemen who, in addition to their job at the factory, were first responders to incidents at the factory. Their role as volunteer firemen help us date this photograph to around the mid-1950s. Take a look at this example of a studio portrait. We can see that the soldier is a lance corporal from a single stripe on his arm. He has an East Yorkshire Regiment cap badge, and although it's pretty blurry, that shape is distinctive. He also has a World War I General Service belt buckle. The rope lanyard on his shoulder and the epaulette badge suggest that this is a dress uniform for a special occasion. The swagger stick is most likely a studio prop, and this photograph is dated to around 1917. Once we've finished examining the subjects of the photograph, we need to know what's going on in the rest of the photograph. If it's in a studio, can we take anything away from the background, the props or the furniture? If it's outside, what are the details? Can we derive the season from the plants or the trees? Are there buildings or structures that can be identified? Are there cars or other types of transport that we can use for dating? Look at the picture on the left. There's lots of things going on. But apart from the buildings and the transport, there are definitely streetlights. This is a high street in a city called Kendal, and streetlights were first installed in 1860. But from the rest of the photograph, we can actually date the photograph to around 1910. Take a look at these examples. On the left, the studio portrait. Could we date the distinctive furniture or the background? And then the street scene on the right. It has a number of clues. There is an advertisement for Three Castle cigarettes. When were those cigarettes on sale? And across the street is the White Swan selling Benskin ale and stouts. I've changed the colour of this picture, which sometimes helps with the details. And a car in the background looks very distinctive. Researching all of these will help us date this photograph fairly accurately. From a family historian's perspective, probably the most important aspect of dating a photograph is comparing your research to what you see in the photograph. Do the ages of the people tie in with what you already know? Does the location of the studio or photograph match the location of your family? Do you know, for instance, if a family member is in the military at a certain age? Do you have any additional photographs of the subject that you can match your face to? It is also important to know the provenance of the photograph too. Be somewhat suspicious of photographs on other people's trees unless you can fully validate the citation, and unfortunately many are not cited. Here are a couple of my own family snapshots, and I'm sure many families have very similar snapshots. And from other photographs, I know the two adults are my maternal grandparents, and the baby in the picture is my mother, who was born in 1934. So this picture is probably pretty easy to date as 1935, assuming my mother's 1 year old approximately. And the foliage in the background tells me it's either spring or summer or early fall. So this is a picture of 1935 approximately. But what if my mother had a sister of about the same age? This picture would be a little bit more difficult to date. I would then have to find out which person the child was by using facial recognition software, which is available on Google. Now that you've examined your photograph in detail and noted all the aspects of the people in the photograph, their clothes, their hair, the context, the background, and all the other features we've discussed, we can start the dating process. Fortunately, there are some very simple ways that will allow most people to start the dating process and get a fairly accurate date of the photograph without having to enlist the help of an expert. When dating photographs, my first stop for almost everything these days is Google. With just some simple queries, Google will direct you to a mine of information and specialist websites for almost any subject imaginable. You can see here just a snapshot of the type of information available for subjects as diverse as US hair styles in the 1850s or men's hats in the 1920s. A feature that not everybody is aware of is the ability to search Google with an image or part of an image. Simply click the camera icon next to the Google search bar, and then you can upload part of an image or an image and do a search based on that image. Google returns similar images which may have already been dated or give you more information about the type of photograph you're looking at. Here you can see I've searched by one of the photographs we looked at earlier of a couple of children, and the results, the visual matches, are many similar photographs of pairs of children, and I can go into those photographs and see what information they hold. And finally, If you exhausted your own research and you still have questions about your photograph or the frame or the background or certain aspects of your photograph and you need further help, you can always reach out to fellow genealogists on a specialty website such as RootsChat or a Facebook page such as Ancestry.com. Here are a couple of examples that were posted relatively recently, and both those queries, both asking for more information on the photograph or the type of dress, had numerous helpful replies. It should be the final thing you try and do. I'm pretty confident most people can get to 99% of the data answers themselves with just a little bit of research. Thank you for listening to this video and watching the slideshow. If you have any comments or questions, please post them below in the comments section. This was part 2 of a 3-part series, and part 3 I'll look at a brief case study and bring some of these things together. In the meantime, have a great day.